I'm Catherine Sievett, the chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the Weitzman School of Design. And I'm very happy to see everyone back from Travel Week, those of you who are traveling, and here this evening for the department's 2025 Department Landscape Architecture Lecture Series, curated by our very own Professor Christopher Marcinkowski. As you know, the fall series is entitled Public Realm Landscape. And it's really an important time to be thinking very deeply in this place and time about that word public, of course, and realm. And Chris is the most capable expert in this domain. So I'm delighted to begin with an introduction of Christopher Marcinkowski. And first of all, welcome back from Travel Week, Chris, where rumor has it, some of your students, maybe all, walked 40,000 steps every day, all day in Tokyo, which I don't think I've ever clocked walking 40,000
It's like
steps.
35,000.
It's not what I heard. Depends on your length of leg, I guess. But it's kind of appropriate for this evening with a talk entitled Walk and Talk. Chris, of course, is a professor here, associate professor here at Penn in the Department of Landscape Architecture, trained and licensed as an architect and an honorary member of the ASLA. Christopher's teaching, research, and professional practice are oriented around issues of contemporary physical urbanization, with an explicit focus on the public realm as a space of design intervention, inquiry, and agency. And of course, these are themes that we're seeing explored across this series of free talks this fall. And we're so delighted this evening to welcome Alma Du Solier, studio director and principal at Hood Design Studio, to join us this evening here in Philadelphia to present a talk entitled Walk and Talk, subtitled Interrogating the Role of the Landscape Architect, Practitioner, Steward, Advocate, Politician, or Activist. So I love that subtitle. I love thinking about walking and talking. How do we talk? How do we translate as landscape architects? How do we listen? And how do we tell stories? But like those 40,000 steps, I like to think about how and why do we walk? And how do we walk and talk in the landscape? And in other words, back up our words with action. So I'm sure many of you know, of course, that walking as a practice has a very long tradition. Ceremonial walks to describe cities, indigenous walkabouts, practices of walking the land as a stewardship. Many of you walked the Hopi Territory last week as well, in northern Arizona. And walking, in fact, in so many ways is activism. Think about all those long distance marches that we hear about that make those 40,000 steps look like child's play. The 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, a pivotal event to the civil rights movement with 250,000 people, or the walk called the Longest Walk of 1978, an activist march and demonstration of indigenous peoples who walked from Alcatraz Island to Washington, D.C., both a spiritual and a political demonstration, and a call for sovereignty, and to protest legislation that would violate treaty rights about the landscape, land, fishing, and mineral rights of peoples. So walking indeed is activist, and let's remember that is one of the things that we can all do together. And talking, of course, is translating and communicating our values. Now, of course, I'd like to invite Chris Marcinkowski to the podium to properly introduce our speaker, Alma Du Solier. So thank you so much for being here, Alma.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I think all of you know who I am, but Chris Marcinkowski, associate professor. I have the pleasure this evening of introducing Alma Du Solier, as Catherine said, studio director at Hood Design. For those of you who I think are all probably familiar, Hood is a cultural practice that looks to merge landscape architecture, public art, and urban design in their work at multiple scales. Alma actually visited us here at Penn during the pandemic, but that was sort of a lifetime ago, and so I think the fact that we get to have her here in person today is much more exciting, and probably going to be much more memorable than on Zoom. As that time
No
was.
pressure.
After growing up in Monterrey, Mexico, Alma initially trained as an architect at the Monterrey Institute of Technology and Higher Education. And after a period of practice working in Mexico, she moved to the Bay Area to study at Berkeley with Walter Hood. And shortly after that, and kind of I think interning even while you were a student, in the practice, joined Hood Design as the third member. So really there from the beginning, the early days of that practice, and was involved deeply in the Young Museum in San Francisco, which is one of the seminal projects of that practice. At Hood Design, as well as at other design studios that she's been involved with, Alma has led significant projects really globally in Latin America, in China, and in the Bay Area. Recent work of the practice at Hood includes the Hilltop Park at the tip of Yerba Buena Peninsula, or Island in San Francisco, Double Consciousness Marker at Princeton University, and the NVIDIA Corporate Campus Landscape. In addition to her practice, Alma is also a lecturer in landscape architecture at Berkeley, where she is an alum, where her teaching focuses on the design process as well as on cultural landscapes. I find her teaching philosophy, statement of teaching philosophy, which by the way, we don't have on our website, but is actually a really cool thing to see in terms of how people do things. Her statement of teaching philosophy notes that she sees teaching as an extension of her work as a practitioner, not separate from it. A key aspect of this approach is a concerted effort to demystify the design process, presenting design not as a magical or mysterious thing, but as a fluid, reactive, and intentional practice. I think that's really exciting and lovely in the context of sharing this work with us all this afternoon. Alma's teaching endeavors to remove the burden of design students as seeing their obligation as saving the world, and rather reframing physical design as merely one layer in the evolving cultural palimpsest of the urban landscape. This approach no doubt draws from Alma's experience as a facilitator and as a communicator, bridging the gap between designers and environmentalists through narrative that leads to meaningful physical interventions through design. In a really lovely interview in September 2023 in Madam Architect, she notes that design is, quote, only really able to set the tone for the new configuration of a site, and that the real beauty is in how the environment and the people using the space will make it theirs and transform it with time and with use. Given the focus of this semester's lecture series on forms of public realm practice, I think the work of Alma Du Solier will no doubt inspire us to see both the value and the possibility in physical design that's emphatically cultural, material, and spatial, work that creatively and compellingly connects people and environment in new and inspiring ways. So with that, please join me in welcoming Alma Du Solier in person, physically here, to the Weitzman School of Design.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I love that you did all the research. I've never been introduced so nicely. Thank you for that. So indeed, I was here, I think it was 2020, here, virtually. And when I first got invited, I felt I could actually kind of not continue, but build up a little bit on the topic that I was describing last time. And last time I had named my presentation Listening. And I had mentioned many ways in which we as a practitioners listen to communities, listen to the sites, listening as a sort of very broad thing. And my last conclusion was, in that sequence, was one of the ways to listen to communities is to kind of being stubborn and opportunistic in a good way. Meaning getting yourself to be a little bit in trouble to move the needle to the direction that sometimes people tell you and sometimes people don't tell you. So I had used this example, which is a project I worked for many years in Milwaukee, which is called the Beer Line. And it was a former rail line where it was called the Beer Line because there were all these beer companies literally running through that line. The rail lines had been abandoned and it turned into a walk. But we were invited to look into this because this is pretty unappealing in the sense it was just a line, and to try to figure out how do you elevate it. We ran a number of community engagement processes and we landed at the conclusion that these communities, because this is also a Black community primarily in that zone of Milwaukee, these communities, what happens is that hiding under the umbrella of like making it safe, making it something that we've seen before and is not scary, we tend to then not invest on those communities. And so this is Hood Design, we're sort of pushing this landscapes of hope idea and talking about how extraordinary, risky, atypical translates into these better communities. And so we had developed a series of ideas of how to really activate each segment of this site. But rather than the pretty pictures as the only way of producing a document, because this has only been built little bits and pieces. We knew that the best way we could serve this community and really sort of pay attention to what they needed is to create a system in which they can come, kind of plug and play in a way, but add up to a whole in which every item or every component of the site, again, encourages investment, not downsizing or simplifying, et cetera, et cetera. So we had developed this is a super long document that even included cost estimating and how you sort of break it into sort of pieces that you can afford and which ones we even included a section on how can they can fundraise for some of those elements, et cetera. One of the sections we had was this idea of where public art can be included. And what happened after I came here, we actually got a grant from the Knight Foundation. Hood Design got a grant. And so we used that money to pay for one of the projects. And so we partnered with a local artist and we did, this was, I think it was right after the pandemic. I think we were coming out and, doing this thing. So this is how I started with like, I'm gonna talk about all these times in which we listen and we move forward. And so the lecture I had initially called it walking the talk, meaning like I talk about all these things, so how are you walking in relationship to how we connect to the community? And normally the way that we do our projects is that we almost design the community engagement as much as we design the site, because how you present a question, how do you present a problem, or how do you understand and repeat what they're telling you sometimes actually changes how you design. So when we think about community engagement, for example, for us, all of these things are mechanisms to get to that result. So we don't have a particular process per se. And sometimes we go super crazy, sometimes we go very simple, etc. In today's environment, I was trying to remember when I was a student, the kind of the key words that we all were using, and this is back in the last millennium, 1999, that's when I finished my graduate program. We didn't have a lot of the vocabulary that we have now. And so for the students here, you have a lot of things to contend with. It's like you have to be co-creating and you have to listen for real and you have to look at the environment and you have to consider climate change. Everything, all of those things have been building up as sort of your job as a landscape architect. I would say in the last 10 years has kind of like the curve has gone up. So I keep saying that maybe my profession was a lot easier when I was starting and it has gotten more complex in a good way. That was my lecture. But then on Tuesday night, somebody broke into my car and stole my computer, which that's me taking a picture to the insurer company, not to bring here. But since I had it, I figure I'm going to show it. So what that meant is that I had to reconstruct this whole presentation this morning because I managed all day yesterday to get a new computer. So it's not an excuse, but if I'm going too long, just stop me because I can get a little carried away. One thing that I did have on that lecture, or that presentation I had before, was this phrase that I always take it with me because to me it's very meaningful. And in all the places that I practice, it's always the thing that I'm trying to push forward, which is this notion that we tend to think that there's an absolute truth or beauty or the right way to do things. And sometimes we ignore that some of the things that from one perspective may appear to be messy or bad or incorrect, indeed they may not. And so it is our job to embrace that and to really open ourselves to figure it out how something that is not of my understanding or from my part of the world is still something that is worth doing. So from that perspective, I went back to what actually drives me today. What is the practice? When I think about public realm, what truly is the thing that pushes forward? And I circle back to this idea of truth, which is what was the premise behind that concept for Milwaukee that I just showed. The truth is you have to be willing to not be loved. You're gonna tell the truth, somebody's gonna not like what you're saying. But that's kind of the practice that we've had. And the reason why I did go to Berkeley and I met Walter Hood when I was a student and I became an intern and then a designer, junior designer. Then I went around the world to other practices and then I came back. And now I am a principal there. But also the other thing is that just a month ago, I am the first partner officially at Hood Design, which brought me back to the reason why I'm going to talk about today about this, which is practice from the perspective, not what we do out in the world and how we engage our communities, but I contend that the only way that you can do the right things that you say you want to do, you cannot design business as usual. Your practice and the way that you think about your projects and your design need to reflect or be willing to understand how to work differently. And that sounds very easy and obvious, and you go like, yeah, of course. It's a lot harder than that. But I am very lucky to have found this path in my life and this particular practice, because indeed, Walter has built this on the things that he believes in and the things that he likes. And truly, now that I signed the paperwork to be partner, I can tell you he does not care about the bottom line. And it's not because he is this, super generous person. It's because he's so passionate about making that indeed that's all that drives him. So if we're doing something like that, it's the right thing. So for me, the main thing I wanted to try to understand, how do I fit on such a legacy? How do I bring that forward? And how do I begin to add, or not add, but contemplate and understand all these other things that we're not asked to consider as a landscape architect? So the way that we define Hood Design Studio is that we focus on culture, but not necessarily on the big C, but on the small c, which is all the stuff that gets us excited. And this is part of that listening, understanding. And when we say listening as well, it's not just listening to humans talking, but also listening to a site, listening to the environment, listening to the little animals, all of those beautiful things. So the way that we organize our work is we talk about lifeways, everyday, and commemoration. The Milwaukee project, the Beer Line project, is the first one that we label a lifeways plan, because we were thinking that if we call it a vision plan or a master plan or a concept plan, people attach meanings to that and they basically react to it. So when Walter came up, this is Walter's word, he came up with the word lifeways, for us was a little bit of a game changer, in that when you think about lifeways, is not a vision that you as the grand designer come. It's actually trying to truly understand how people behave. How do you live your normal life and bring it forward? If it's like, I need to sit on the shade. I like to, I work in front of this fancy museum and this is what I do. So when you think of lifeways, you begin to open the umbrella of who is your user, who is going to be engaged in your space, etc. So it's a slightly different frame of mind in my mind to understand public realm. Because public realm is very nebulous. It's not very clearly defined. It's not always public, many times it's private. This project, the museum, the land that we're inhabiting as designers is private in reality. But in practice, you are there. You use it and it feels public. So that's actually an important thing that we always have to try to consider. The second aspect of that is the everyday, and this is, you don't need to get fancy. Sometimes it's as simple as providing a single material, understanding how you're going to stop and take your bus, etc. Sometimes it's just about, what kind of plans we have. My client calls this, I think in a positive way, they call it a beast, because I decided to plant this crazy California grapevine that when it gets big in the summer, it's like all over. So it has become an everyday thing for them, like they know it, and this vine grows and goes away. So for us, those kinds of things, this idea of rituals and practices is what makes the everyday part of the design. And then lastly, Walter has been for many, many years, and by definition then Hood Design, we've been very involved in commemoration. Partly because obviously Walter's lived experience as a Black man in America carries a lot of baggage, and how do you then begin to give voice to communities that have gone through that life and that, being overlooked, being abused, being all that, and to sort of make it into something that tells stories. So we've done a lot of projects in which we are literally expressing the stories through form making in the public realm. And that's what led the practice to move a little bit more strongly into the idea of art. And I am an architect and a landscape architect, definitely not an artist. And I don't say that in a bad way, I'm just saying it's not how my brain thinks. So in a partnership with Walter, Walter is an artist in many ways. His brain does work as an artist. And if you have any friend that is an artist, you know what I mean. Designers work one way, artists work the other. But we kind of come together And we try to figure out again how those three aspects of everybody's life can be expressed on the public realm. So people call our work a little bit whimsical sometimes. Sometimes they call it heavy. But the idea is that we're trying to tell multiple stories through means that are not necessarily always obvious, but sometimes pretty on your face. What I wanted to share today in me thinking of this was maybe a little bit of the arc of my career personally. Obviously, I'm extremely influenced by how Walter and Hood Design works, but I also have my own sort of influences. Like Chris did a very good job explaining some of those things, so thank you for that. But the point is that I believe, and partly at Berkeley, I'm a lecturer, not a faculty member. And at Berkeley, after a certain moment of time as a lecturer, they ask you to go through an evaluation process. So that's why I have a statement now, because I didn't have one. You have to tell the university why you're a good person to teach. Since you're not a faculty member, you don't go through the normal tenure process. So you're just somebody out of the street coming and teaching. So they're like, wait a minute, what are you up to? What do you do? So I had this very sort of strange year of retrospection into like, what do I teach? Why do I teach? And what I concluded is that, yes, a lot of what we do is driven by listening, but that then needs to be translated into a design process that begins to represent that. This is just a picture I took a few months ago. We were trying to sort out in our brains how to do this crazy thing. Walter believes a lot, and I do too now by extension, that if you're gonna do an idea, you have to do 20 of them. And if you think of 20 ideas, you have to come up with 40. And I am not exaggerating. So we had all these ideas and we were trying to do these things for a presentation for a community. And at some point I'm like, okay, let's put it all on the floor. And we started putting little marks, etc. And this is just our map to try to figure out what exactly are we trying to communicate? How are we going to communicate this process to our community? So it hit me that we do this more often than not. It sounds like weird, but like we take over the space and start mapping things to clarify our ideas. The reason why I think this is important and very relevant to this day and age is because also to make things a little bit easier, since we have not enough topics to cover, now you have AI. And so how are we as humans gonna maintain relevance, I guess, is partly how do we bring the human factor to spaces. And this is specifically, in my opinion, is specifically really important in the public realm. Because each space, if we start unifying, making it all consistent, we're gonna lose the humanity of our spaces, and that's very tricky. So I contend that the way that we work to develop the ideas, if you're sitting at a computer doing Rhino all day long, which by the way, I love Rhino, so don't get me wrong, but if you just do that as your only way to test an idea, you miss out. So we constantly have this conversation about, well, I have that model made in Rhino. We can see it, walk through it, we put in Lumion, so it looks super fancy and realistic, so we're done, right? You then make it physical, and then you go like, oh my God, I hadn't figured this other connection. And I think that's what actually for us is part of this process of practicing. When I joined Hood Design the second round, I left and then came back. I said to myself, I need to teach myself how to run a practice. So again, Walter does not care about the bottom line, meaning that the practice was so like, we just go through the flow. And I'm like, I need to hire people, so I need to do this right. But for those of you who are roughly my age, which is nobody in this room, but back in the day when you were finishing your degree, there were, in landscape architecture, at least my perception, there are only two things that matter as a practitioner. That you were professional, and that meaning like you deliver your drawings on time and in perfection, and like you follow all the code, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not advocating for breaking the law or not following code, but what about all the other aspects? So these, being just professionals and meeting the bottom line are just too narrow or parameters to understand how to practice. This book, by the way, has a lot of very good clarity on how to do that. So if you haven't read it, just read it. This is how practice was as of last millennia. I'm hoping all of you, and this is my new thing, how do we create new practices for the benefit of our communities? Lucky enough, last week I was in New Orleans because I'm part of the Landscape Architecture Foundation, and this foundation, I love it because I get the privilege of engaging with 35 leaders of landscape architecture around the US in the only context in which you're not competing with each other. It's interesting, we spent 3 days together and nobody ever asks, so what are you working on today? Which is any other social endeavor you go as a professional, if it's surrounded by landscape architects, they're like, so what are you working on? And everybody's like competing and like, oh, I have all these things and I do more than you and I'm nicer than you and all this. This group, for some reason, we just talk about the things that we want to do as an organization and nobody asked that. So it got me thinking about how I've learned so much about how these different practices behave. Some are very professional, some are very different. There's biohabitats here in our board, and they have decided, for example, that they want to bring nature as one of their board members. So all the decisions that they do that. So I've realized after 6 years in this organization that I myself been trying to figure out how do I navigate between the legacy I have from hood design and not inventing, but trying to figure out what is the right component of a new practice. It also helps that I live in the Bay Area. And there, as you know, the gig economy and basically people have in other professions done this already. They decided we're not going to follow the parameters and these people are trillionaires, right? So I'm not in the goal of becoming a trillionaire, but I am in the goal of figuring out how we do a better practice. So also when you finish school, you come out and you can get to choose where you can really engage meaningfully, because that's part of it. This is where I was born, Monterrey, Mexico. I did study architecture, went to Berkeley, and then my first job was at hood design. And indeed at hood design, I got exposed to things that didn't necessarily was what I was expecting landscape architecture would be. One of the first projects I did, Walter and I did this installation in Sonoma. It's called the Eucalyptus Soliloquy. And we were coming off, at the same time we were working on the de Young Museum, and we're coming off on the idea that in Golden Gate Park, which is where the de Young is situated, there's a long-range master plan to eliminate all the eucalyptus, because the eucalyptus don't belong in California and they actually have all kinds of implications for the ecosystem. But having said that, they have been in the context for so long that they culturally are meaningful to people. And they're humongous trees. They're like, I don't know how tall that tree is that is next to the tower of the de Young Museum, but like very, very tall. So it's kind of this weird thing about like, yeah, you're a bad tree, but like, oh, should we cut you, So we decided to do this installation about like just celebrating the eucalyptus in a way that does not, propagate them in a way. So we ended up doing these things. I love sewing as well. It's one of my things. So we did this eucalyptus soliloquy as sewing. And this was the first time I thought, this is a garden. And yet, it's not a garden. Okay? This is many, many years ago. But it began to sort of plant that seed that what we define as what we do matters as much as what we actually end up doing. And giving ourselves the permission to, what if we just do this garden this way? And it's a garden because you tend to it. It includes plants, but it's not in a normal manner done. What does that bring you? What does that actually tell you? For the de Young Museum, it sits on the Golden Gate Park area facing the Pacific Ocean. And what we ended up doing here, and this is my first job right out of school. I think I was 27 years old. Seems like a lifetime ago, because they just turned 20. So what we ended up doing is we did an inventory of the whole park and then came up with ideas for each of the gardens to represent each one of those alien landscapes that in the future of the long-range master plan, they will be gone. Because the de Young Museum, as a collection, if you've ever been to San Francisco, the collection is a very eclectic collection, very controversial in so many ways, but it has pieces from all over the world. So we thought, well, what if landscape is a museum? And then you bring all these pieces that eventually will not be present in the park, but you can come here and see them. So each of the zones, each of the gardens is a little different. You cannot see all the spaces uniformed, and they don't fully match the park adjacent to it, but that's intentional. We're trying to call a space and claim a space for that reason. So for me, it was a immense educational process to try to understand how you begin to translate, again, things that are not as obvious to physical spaces. One of my jobs, because I was the junior person in the team, although the firm was only 3 people, so I was the junior and also the PM and all these crazy things. The detailing on this courtyard, that was my thing. So I had to do the header. That was my thing. And I'm telling you, it's hard, but I got fascinated by it. After a couple years there, now the hot topic around us is H-1Bs, right? So back in the day, I was a hood design. I did not have, I had my OPT that I got from Berkeley. When I needed an H-1B, Walter's like, I'm not sure what you're talking about. He knows now exactly what those are, but back then he's like, no, I don't think I can do that. So I got a job at Ito that knew exactly what an H-1B was, and here I am. So the first project I did at Ito is called the Tuolumne River Regional Park, and I was just coming fresh out of hood design. And this is a project that Ito had these different departments. It was landscape architecture, environmental planning. So this project, for some reason, belonged to the environmental planning group, and the designers in my team, they're like, we don't want to talk to them. They all want to make it about restoration. Because back then, obviously, we were not talking about biodiversity. We were not talking about resiliency. We were talking about restoration, which, if you think about it for a second, restoration is not the same as these other words. Restoration means going back in time. Go back to some unknown period in the history of the site and keep it there and don't touch it. And humans out. But I was coming from wood design, and so somebody had done a master plan on the site and had decided that the site needed to be, this is by code. State of California demands that you provide 100 foot of restoration along this river, and the rest you can do whatever you want, park, access, whatever. But when I got the project, I got it because I was the new person in the team, and they're like, you're the new, you get to talk to them, because they didn't want to work, and I'm like, and I loved it, because honestly, it was the way for me to begin to make that bridge between the environmental planners, which think very differently, and design. When I was advancing this project, one of my peers told me, like, how come you always get all the cool projects? I'm like, this one? Yeah, and I'm like, I don't know, nobody wanted it, so I took it. But it's kind of this interesting thing, like, I got so excited about like playing with environmental people that now everybody wanted to play with environmental people. But my whole premise was, don't stop the restoration and don't stop the access. Can we test that out? And then, of course, I had been educated by your pastor here at Berkeley. They used to teach Ian McCarg. I don't know if they do it anymore. But so I started with that, like, so what are the layers? And the difference was the 185, I lied, it wasn't 100, 185 thing was just a random jurisdictional line. So what I ended up doing, which actually was made, is that I said, all that area, I'm going to give you more area, but instead of following a jurisdictional line, I'm going to listen to the river. So meeting with my partners in the environmental team, they had all these hydraulic studies, and they had identified that the radius of curvature that this river would have had if we were going to stop it with channelization would have gone that way. So to me, it was like, in that corner, we had this railroad historic trestle that we wanted to preserve, so I couldn't really move any dirt there. But on the other side, so we negotiated that, and we convinced CEQA. Those of you who may not be familiar, that's the California Environmental Quality Act. Very difficult to convince to think outside the box, and yet they approved it. So we did all this grading. We studied how the water was going to kind of different events, etc. How does that translate it to the planting? I learned how to do this restoration planting, which you do all these cells and you let the plants go wild. It's pretty amazing. So each one of these cells is crafted to be a good combination of plants that live together, and then you just do this crazy stapling around the site. And then I married that with the levels of access, so who gets to have more access when you're a little bit more upland and more lowland, etc. So I got all fascinated with that, but I didn't forget my hood design thing. And I'm like, but we have to build something that looks like that. So we decided that we were going to do these benches, which the more dominant species of each of the terraces, we only got to build one because the client they didn't get all the other funding that they were going to get. So the funding that they got was to do this one big arc and the restoration on the bottom. So still pretty good. At the same time, right around that same time, because I was the Mexican in the team, we got actually a project in Mexico. And I'm like, you have to do it. So in this case, I took the same approach of layers, but this is the first time I started thinking, there are all these layers here on the site from a natural standpoint. But in this particular location, the governor of the state, which is the client, they wanted to have all of the different elements that live around, historic and cultural elements that live around the state, to actually be copied into the site. And I said, well, we're not going to copy them, all of them. But what we're going to do instead, try to understand how they live, because each one of these, there's like mines all the way to this aqueduct. They have also this sort of layer approach. So I began to marry those two systems and try to use that as a way to organize the spaces in this crazy topography, because this is basically a hill. The architects already had a master plan, so I couldn't really move the buildings because they were already actually building foundations by the time I got there, because one of my thoughts was like, move the buildings out of the hill, but too late. I had to work within that. But the concept was from the architects is like, there's just one line. I think my arrow moved, but they should be on the other side. What I did instead was like, okay, we have these layers that build from the ground up. We have the layers of culture, and I mapped all these ways in which people are going to move in the space. So I decided that instead of going up and down, you should be moving around. So I had built this model, which my boss at the time, she was like, we don't have budget for these. Why are you making models? This is an Ito, right? And I'm like, because I come from design and we make models for everything. So I did this at night because I'm like, I'm not going to show her that I'm doing it so she wouldn't stop me. But that was actually what led us to understand how to organize this design. So all the site, I'm not going to dwell into this, but every one of those layers then appears on this literally topographical, reading the layers of the site becomes spaces. The project got built and it's still there. It's actually all the agencies that serve public in the state of Zacatecas, which is a state in Mexico, come here. So we made all the different gardens. And because this client only spoke Spanish and the contractors only spoke Spanish, so it was pretty much my job. Super fun, actually. I recommend it highly. So, but every one of these elements, it was very interesting. The client would understand what I meant because, for example, they wanted to get rid of all the excavation. And I'm like, no, but that's actually goes here. And because of the concept of the layers, they were like, yeah, that makes sense. So they left it in place. We did copy one of the things, which are those silos, because the governor wouldn't let me go. So we did it. But we made them into this community commercial elements. And then the last job that I'm going to show here for my experience at Ito is this project in LA. I worked in many, many phases. It was about 10 years, the duration I was at Ito, in which, in this case, the layers of history became the way in which we try to replicate the new or create the new space. So this was LA back in the day. And then they kept adding and adding and adding and adding and adding and adding. And it became, if you go today to the Port of LA, it's the biggest port in the whole wide world. It receives all of the stuff that you get that says made in China, most likely came through this port. So it's humongous. So here the concept that we started to look at is like, if they built this port through these actions or these mechanisms, can we find a parallel and do the same but in reverse to create this public realm? Impossible to restore the site. That's the whole notion. You can't really restore this level of infrastructure, but can you really play their game? And so we started with this notion that the port always goes with, like, they built a little innocent breakwater, and then behind the breakwater they start filling, and then next thing you know, you have a terminal with huge ships. So we took over this parking lot and we said, let's just build this little line, and then from there we go. So this project got built, and then we got 4 subsequent phases of this work. For me, it was pretty transformational. Again, it was the first time we were introducing a lot of this planting on an environment that did not understand or love or like plants. But now they're actually super integrated in the site and they still maintain them pretty well. So to me, this is one of my favorite pictures because you have an actual functioning humongous port and then you have kids playing next to it. So to me, that's kind of what I talk about, this public realm craziness should be that. But then Ito was bought by AECOM, and I'm not going to dwell into that experience, but AECOM is not Ito. It was very different and decided I needed to get out of there. And so I re-hood and I came back. While I was out, Hood Design had grown their practice from the de Young Museum into building a lot of different museums. It became something that we actually know how to do. I didn't participate in any of these except for the de Young. Those all happened while I was out. But so when I came back, I'm like, so what is this practice now? So it had become all fanciful and they're doing fancy museums. But the truth is that the opposite was the case. And it was interesting that Walter kept saying, you have to embrace the weird. You have to embrace the odd. And I'm like, there you go. That's the phrase. You have to understand what is weird and bring it in a good way. So for the Oakland Museum, for example, the whole way the process was done to engage community was I want to do this map so people can walk on the maps instead of sort of seeing them on a wall. And so It changed how people were seeing, and there's many changes that happened here, but if you pay attention to this little corner here, the premise of this design was to break the wall, because this museum faces the lake. It's called Lake Merritt in Oakland, and that pristine corner was like blocked because it was built in an era when that was not necessarily a good thing. So for us, that was the existing condition before, and basically was a simple move, just breaking the wall. This was very controversial. So from the moment in which we proposed it until it was built, 10 years went by. So this is also to say, this is going back to that initial statement about you have to be stubborn, you have to stay and continue. Because a lot of the very professional practices that I've been engaged, even when I was at Ito, you say, we're gonna break this wall. Somebody would say, no way. And they go like, okay, the client said no, let's move on. And hood design is like, I don't hear you. We're gonna break this wall. And so we're gonna come back with another way to break the wall, so you agreed to break the wall. No, we're not gonna break the wall. Okay, yes, we're gonna break, you're saying maybe not, but yes, right? So that, so I love that. So I wanna always sort of keep reminding me that not doing what you're told is not always necessarily a bad thing. This is one of the projects that I did participate in this at the very end of the project, but it's one of the most important ones, and I bring it in here because after Walter did all the other museums and he got involved in this, my team is not just Walter alone, but this museum needs to be elevated from the water due to flooding. So that opened up this crazy space underneath. Speaking of public realm, it's public but not public. And Walter had done this whole effort to talk into all these different descendants and other members of the community that were invested in this project. And this is, for those of you who may not know, this is a pier where it's believed that about 40% of the enslaved individuals that came from Africa entered the United States. And it had been abandoned, not abandoned, but raised. Like nobody knew. It was this very safe little garden. So the mayor of Charleston had this idea, we need to bring this to light. And so that's how this came about. And Walter took over all the land underneath the building. But the one thing that did change in the practice is that this was the one time in which Walter, for the first time, in hood design, for the first time, we were doing art proper. We always intervene and integrated pieces that one can qualify as art, but this is the first time that that was meant intentionally. Each one of these pieces has a layer of the diaspora. Each of these pieces has a lot of the histories and the stories that we heard and collected. I'm not gonna be able to cover all of these today, but I give you a kind of like a visual. When you think of this space, to me, this is the other thing. Speaking of this, giving yourself permission to do things. Somebody who doesn't know, and you tell you, like, this was done by a landscape architect, people go like, what? No, there's no planting. So it's kind of this other thing of like, how do you define what we do? Can take many shapes and forms and can be very provocative, and it can be very expressive. And to me, so when I came back after being in the Ito world and AECOM later, back to hood design, it felt like truly like coming back home and like, yes, let's figure it out. And in this new dimension and this new elements that have been created, how do we fit in? So when I joined this project, we were kind of exploring this idea of these badges and how do we break them and how do we, put them as a piece, and how do we get these walls? And so it was actually pretty interesting just coming at the CA stage just to understand how do we make them. But the interesting thing again is like how they had been conceived as an idea was so hands-on that in order to fabricate it was actually almost like a natural progression. While they were doing that beautiful work, I got assigned this job, or I took it, and so this is NVIDIA, quite opposite in the spectrum. So how do you bring to corporate America, and tech in particular, some meaning to it? So I started with similar themes that I follow. This was like, how do we connect to the specific California landscapes, and more importantly, how do we translate those into the spaces that we use? And so we ended up with this space that has these, what we call the tree houses. So this is a landscape, again, not in the normal manner. It's a landscape that has a ground, and then it has a second level. And everybody thinks that the second level was done by the architects, but it was done by the landscape architects. And it almost killed me, but it is actually something that we did. So what that allows us to do is that we created all these different environments and celebrated all these natural systems that if we would have had to touch everything on the ground, we would have been unable to plant as much as we planted. Because when we started this project, we said, you should have canopy and like 1 million trees. So answer to that presentation was a no. We're not going to have that many trees. So we ended up with the tree houses and all of these things to maintain the number of trees that we wanted to do. And to prove to them that you can still work, you can still do all these different things. So this idea of building on their own perception of what is their everyday was what actually allowed us to get really, whimsical here. One of the things that I insisted on was all of these circles. They included all the water detention that is required in California to manage water, stormwater, and normally civil engineers put them on the edge of the building. So like the usable space doesn't have any of that. So we introduce it in the middle. So these rushes that you see here in the corner, that's the detention area, but you're in the middle of it all the time. So to me, this notion of every day includes all those systems. Every day in California, it rains, I believe, only once every 6 months, so it's not very common, but there is, when it rains, that the water accumulates there. And that's the beast. It is a beast, actually. This project is the one that Chris mentioned. It's called Yerba Buena Island, and the park was called Hilltop, and now they switched the name to Panorama Park. The project has been designed and then put on hold and then VE'd and then VE'd again. So by the time I got in, we were redoing the project one more time with the idea of saving money, yet again. It had already passed 5 years by the time I joined this project. So my job was to kind of make it happen. But to me, the main thing is that how do we preserve what is the essence of this project? We did lose a ton of elements. And Walter, at some point, he's like, I don't care about this project. They're not doing anything that we wanted. So it became my project, which I loved. But the only thing I knew is that the way that this project had become about, this is a former Navy base that people in the Bay Area had never been in this location. It's the most amazing view of the whole city, but it was Navy, so nobody could come in. On top of this hill, there was a water tank. And so the concept of, there were many, many pieces, remnants that we wanted to preserve as this idea of preserving the relics. As to build sort of connection to the site. Slowly they had demolished, in those 5 years when they were pondering whether we should do the project or not, they demolished a lot of those things. So by the time I got in, I'm like, where's relic number 1? Oh, that's gone. We deleted it like a while ago. I'm like, ah. But we actually were able to manage to keep this tank. And one of my most interesting anecdotes with my client is that when we opened this tank, this is the walls that you're seeing here, we cut it here, and then the tank, that level that you see there is like about half of the tank. So this would go up another 20 feet, and that was the big tank. So what we did is we cut it, well, I didn't, but the contractors who are awesome, they cut it literally like that. And for us, what's important that the cut was visible and that the materials were as honest as possible. My client, on the other hand, when they first sort of opened this up, it's like, are you going to put some finish? Are you going to paint it? So we had to try some of those mock-ups to prove to them, don't do anything. Just leave it alone, and it's rough and tumble, and it is what it's meant to be. The site, again, the recurring theme of eucalyptus. Eucalyptus were also, they're going to be removed from Yerba Buena Island, and so all the trees had been cut, and for some reason they preserve all the eucalyptus wood, which is one of the hardest woods to work with, but we did this bench. As we were wrapping up the project, and this is where this notion of what I've been doing lately is, I stick around. I don't leave my projects, which is probably not very financially logical, but it is actually what I think sometimes the right thing. For those of you who may not know, Port Chicago was a big explosion that took place in the 1940s during World War II. All the victims of this incident were African-American soldiers who then were accused of mutiny by not wanting to, those who survived, not wanting to come back to work. They were trialed and found guilty, and the location where the trial took place is right on top of our site. So that water tank and in front of it, that was the trial site. You can kind of see it in the image. So when we were finishing this project, there's a museum called the Treasure Island Museum. They reached out to us and said, we want to add something about this moment in history, because now we found the archive work that this was the site exactly. My client, what they said, well, we have a whole signage program in this island. Let's just put a sign and put it there. And I was like, no. At this time, Walter was saying like, I'm not part of this project. And I'm like, I'll do it. So we interview the folks from the museum. We actually researched National Park System was the one, they have an actual memorial on the site of the explosion, and they were partners on this process. They participated with us to create this sequence of not just a sign, but something that begins to explain that what the disaster was, the Navy's response, the mutiny, the trial, and the resonance, because this trial was pivotal in changing the perception. And so all the armed forces began to be desegregated based on this incident. It's a very long story that I'm not gonna be able to describe right now. But this is just to describe the way that I proceeded to go about this work. Was half of it was what we had left on our fee. And for any of you who have actually built projects, by the time you're done with your project, you don't have a whole lot of fee left, but I'm like, this is important work, we have to do it. So I convinced some of my team members to help me to figure out some of these things. So we worked together to develop these ideas. The museum obviously was excited and happy to support us. So we created this display that allows, and people have told us that you get to read this and understand this history, and you're standing there looking to the site. So again, this is one of my examples of, if you stay around, sometimes these interesting things become reality, and then that's how you basically make the site complex. Do any of you own watches, like real watches? Nobody does that anymore. But I love that the watchmakers, like when you have like the date or you have a thing, they call it complexities. Is that that's the term? Complications, I'm sorry. So I'm not a watch person, but my husband is. So when a watch designer is looking at designing a watch, they do the basic stuff. It tells you the hour, and then they add what they call complications, which is this moves this way, and this gives you the date, and this does this and that. So I feel like our work sometimes as designers is add those complications, because if you stay at the baseline, I feel like we're missing out. Second example, I'm going to try to move faster because I don't even know what time it is, but People's Park is a very controversial project in Berkeley, California. It's right next to my university. The site belongs to the university, except that it has been considered a public park for many years. City of Berkeley has been offered the site. Can you take it and be a park? And the City of Berkeley says no. Because it's a site where the free speech movement is credited to have been exploded. It's a site where people have used it for public speaking and for many other things, but also comes with a lot of problems. It's a complicated site where like drugs are present and violence is present and a lot of other things. Partly because it's a no man's land that allows you to be yourself, indeed. And so the community members that we interviewed, and we participated with, that's what they were telling us. Like, we were left alone here, indeed. The University of California, as a public university, is required to provide a certain number of housing for all the students, and they're in violation of that because they don't provide enough. So the long-range master plan of the university has identified every single site that they have to add housing. So my project was, in this park that everybody has perceived as park, we need to integrate a building for 1,000 students to live in. So I'm a landscape architect, so you hear that and you go like, why did you do that? You are taking a park and turning it into a building site. That's an evil thing to do. And you can see from the comments from the community that they were not necessarily thrilled. Most of the community members were coming to our meetings complaining and not wanting to participate. How do you do then work? We created this timeline and said, well, this park, this site has been many other things. The public realm that you're embracing is not static. It has changed. So we created this, hood design. So we had 9 options. They wanted us to submit 2, and we submitted 9, and everybody went crazy. But what we ended up being able to do is to use this. Now it's frozen. There you go. To use this as a mechanism to have conversations, which was my main goal, is to be able to continue to talk to the community that didn't want to talk to us. We succeeded to a certain degree, but not to the level, oops. I don't know what that means, but maybe it's because I'm over time. All right. We did 9 options. We continued to study them, and what we ended up doing, I skipped that slide, but is out of all those three eras and all those different moments in history, what we decided to do is let's bring a piece of it and represent it on the site. So the park itself tells the story. I don't want to tell it, but there you go. I think my computer is just getting tired. She's new. We don't know each other yet, so I think she's like not understanding how this works. All right. Well, I can finish the presentation without the beautiful pictures. So for this project, what we ended up doing, we did the design. The community was still not talking. They were actually suing the university. Eventually, the university won the case and never spoke with the community. So I work for the university. They're like, your job is done. We love this plan. You say incorporates all the history. Don't worry about it. We're going to run with it. But I was like, no, this is not right. This is my people. We need to let them talk. We need to hear them out. So what I did is I proposed, and this was actually me, because Walter was like, this is your thing. I don't know why you're getting yourself involved in this crazy process. So even he's afraid of Berkeley people because they're a little bit intense. So we put a proposal together to tell the university, let me continue this commemoration exploration with whomever wants to hear us. I'll do it on my own, and I'm happy to go. I'm a big woman. I can go to these conversations and be yelled at. The way we organized it is we created all these focus groups instead of big meetings, because if you do a big meeting with an angry community, you're not going to get anything out of it other than they'll vent, and maybe it's good for them, but I don't know. So we've been meeting with all of them, and then we created then on top or adjacent or involved in the site, basically 7 different moments of commemoration that would speak to the different community members, because also it's a fallacy to say, everybody, we want to commemorate this site. We're going to do this one thing, and everybody would understand what the site was about. So we said that's impossible. So through having these conversations, which were not easy, and most people ignore me, and they wouldn't actually come talk to us, I delayed the process for about a year, so my client was not super happy about it, but they understood, at least the communication director from the university was like, what you're doing is valid, so let's go for it. So we met with as many people as they wanted to talk to us, and we developed the process to create the commemoration, to have them come and talk to us. So we did achieve. I had on slide an image of Lisa Teague, who's one of the founders of People's Park, meaning people that were there in 1969 when the protest was happening, and she belongs to what is called People's Park Council, that are the ones who sued the university. So the fact that she came to our studio and talked to us, to me was like a big thing. And to prove the fact that if you really mean well, like, because I was like, I really want to make sure that your story is not erased, truly. And then people do to come talk to you, and it actually becomes an important thing. So that was my other way of stubbornly staying in order to see something else. The fact that Walter has built this platform in which commemoration as a form of art and landscape at the same time could coexist, this is all to sort of full circle. Why I mentioned those examples. Because then I have the possibility to say credibly, I know how to do this. We can create these moments, these elements, these celebrations on the site, and the client was coming along with us. I can try one more time. There was just one last example I wanted to close with, and that is not going to happen. It's so our studio in Oakland, California is located in West Oakland. So West Oakland is a historically Black community in Oakland. Like, I would say almost all Black communities in the US at some point got cut off by a freeway. The whole thing is a disaster. But Walter has been there out of principle in a way for all these years, and we're not going to move. But a block away from our office, there's a high school. It's called McClymonds High School. McClymonds is primarily Black students, all of them. We were asked to help them do the landscape design for their renovation, which, don't freak out, but the last time that school had been renovated was 35 years ago. So the level of renovation that this high school requires is changing the plumbing because there's lead in the plumbing. So that's the level of insanity. So I come as a landscape architect, and I'm like, so the public realm sucks, actually. There's like asphalt galore. These kids have, I counted them, 13 trees in the entire 2-block campus. It's insane. And the soil is so polluted with lead that you cannot just open up and plant 1,000,000 trees, because I did offer that, and they ran me out of the office and say, you don't know what you're talking about, which is true. So what we landed on was to say, we're going to do all these planters and just put small trees in it, etc. And I proposed like many things, and then VE, 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 VE. I ended up with like, I had a plan that I was going to say, I'm embarrassed to show you, but literally has 3 things in it. One of the things that then I left in there was a bench. And this bench was meant to be done in all these different pieces that add up together. I convinced the school district to let me talk to the students at the high school, and we ended up doing this program in which we donated our time with my team. We were just going to go and talk to the students one day, show them what they could do, and then the shop teacher, who's an amazing person, is like, yeah, do you want to come back? Do you want to come back? So long story short, we ended up being there like for a full semester, taking the students through the whole design process and building this bench, one bench, that became this, 2005, class of 2005 memorial bench. So to me, that was something, I invited all my team to come. A few of them came, and we were consistently going. And my only condition to my team was, you need to come, help out in whatever you want. You don't need to be here all the time, but you are not allowed to publish this in any social media. Meaning, you're not coming here to like, selfie, I'm so good, I'm helping the community. Like, no, not at all. Our social communications person in the end was like, can I publish now something about my climates? I'm like, not yet. So in the end, I think she posted something. But the whole time to me, like, we need to be focused on what we're trying to do. At the end, my conclusion, I thought what I was doing there was to create a connection with the students. And my whole hope was, since we cannot do a big, influential landscape design, I want to create a ritual. Can we think of something that, because for me, that, again, everyday life ways, the reason why we love our public realm is because we gather for ritual with other people, otherwise we wouldn't gather with. So we created this bench, 2025. Mr. Evans, he was such a fantastic partner because he literally let me do whatever I wanted to do with, and he was helping. And at the end, when we concluded the bench, which I would love to show you because he was kind of pretty, he said, well, next year we're going to do a jumble gym. And I'm like, okay, fine. So my point is, in the end, what I learned is that it wasn't about the students. These are teenagers. Most of them, they didn't know what this old lady was trying to do. They did understand it, but my point is that they're now in college, sort of having a great life, not even thinking about this experience at all. But Mr. Evans is a young professor. He went to Stanford as an engineer and decided to become a high school teacher out of the love and passion for education. And he created this shop program that had been canceled by the school district back then. So kindred spirits, like, tell me, how can I help you? So I figured that our connection in that case was not with the receivers of the work, but with Mr. Evans. So I told him at the end, like, I'm here for you. If these kids get it, that's your job. You're in charge of them. I just want to help you. So to me, that actually is something I wouldn't have known if I wouldn't actually offer to be there. So my project's still going to go on construction. And he keeps saying, well, when your work gets done, you'll be here. I'm like, oh, it's going to be so minimal, but okay. So, but I think to me, that's the last project I was going to show. And circles back to the idea of what is truth. It takes so many shapes and forms. It's not a process that you can outline in a little book like the one I show you. That's a very helpful book. So I had this phrase that I always sort of try to remember, especially practicing with the communities that we get a chance and opportunity to practice, and that is that design is never neutral. You must have heard it. It's not my phrase, and I can't remember right now who actually said it. But design is never, ever neutral. It either hurts or heals. Never anything in between. What I add to that phrase is that I agree, but also intention matters. So none of us want to damage, none of us want to hurt. But sometimes we hurt out of, ignorance, incompetence, circumstances. The one aspect that I cannot prevent that. I am ignorant, I am incompetent, and I mess up. The one thing that I feel out of all this, putting together this lecture, to me that is the most important, is that at least I need to want to do the right thing, and wanting to do the right thing and open to be ugly, messy, confusing, and avoiding having professionalism as your only metric, to me, is it does change. So if I hurt without meaning, I apologize and try to fix it. But if I mean with the right intention, at least I feel that that counts for something. That's the kind of practice I'm trying to figure out how to build. So thank you. That's it. I hope I didn't kill my new computer.
Are you okay with questions, Alma?
Yeah, for sure. I don't know I actually do not know what time it is because I realized I have my watch in California time. Oh, okay. Yeah, is there any questions?
Thank you so much for your talk. Wonderful. I appreciate the closing statement you just made. And I was curious about how you approach humility in your work, and how do you move forward with the acknowledgement that failure is possible, and what are the day-to-day strategies that you can incorporate that work?
I mean, I would say that I don't have the exact answer to that. I don't know if you guys heard the question, but the only example I can cite is my most recent for me has been People's Park. Because if you can imagine the University of California having these people suing them, these are very vocal people all over the sort of liberal newspapers, and some of the actual not so liberal were attacking the university constantly. Social media was all over the place. And there was a moment in which I didn't get to show the pictures, but the university tried to start the construction, and then protesters came and destroyed the fence, the construction fence, which are like this typical chain link fence. And so this was happening in November or December. I went on holiday, came back. After I had already started these focus groups, I come back in January, and the university had decided to build a construction fence that was containers, stacked double size around the site. That's how the project is getting built, because they cannot risk. I mean, to their defense, like they're saying they're protecting public safety, because yeah, you can get hurt if you go to a construction site. But the look, the what do you call not the visuals, but the optics was not bad. The worst. It was the worst horrible thing. And because I was doing this process kind of on my own sort of rowdy way, and the university was not necessarily super aware. They were aware because I was checking with them all the time, but they were like, Alma, you do your thing. And if you get in trouble, it's you, not us. And I'm like, I'm all for that. So I was in the middle of that process. I come back and then there's containers there, and there's protesting obviously starting, because now it's like people who even had anything to do with the park, like, why do you have this crazy, concentration camp situation going on here? I go back and I'm like, what am I going to do? So for a moment, as a normal human, which probably, I don't know if normal is the right word, but as a human, I was like panicking. I'm like, I cannot go and talk to these people now with that thing sitting on the street. Like, what am I going to do? So all I did was like, okay, I need to continue. And this is why I talked to one-on-ones. I started like, let's have our meeting that we say we're going to have. Yes, that's horrible, but can we keep your voice here? Can we what would you want people to remember this park for? And so putting myself out there, I think, is the only thing I can say. I mean, they can probably tell that I was a little freaked out, but you're talking one human at a time, and humans are humans. They're not yelling at me because it's just the two of us. So I was able to continue my conversations, and that gave me some confidence to talk to more people. Have I talked to everybody I wanted to talk to? No. Many people still say, talk to the hand. How dare you come and talk to me after this is happening? When they were putting these things, there was the protesting and the police came, but they didn't do anything. They were standing there because I saw some of the footage. And yet in social media, there was like police brutality. I had one person in my team who actually resigned because they're like, I can't deal with this project. And I'm like, oh. But at the end of the day is that being able to say, I don't know the solution. I don't control all these factors, but what I control is this. I can bring some of that to the site so it's not forgotten. that actually opened the window to some people, and that's the only thing I can think of. Like, it's again going back to being stubborn. Like, don't give up. Like, it's not gonna be lovely. People are not gonna like it. And how this is gonna go down in history, I honestly do not know. I did actually stop looking at social media because I was crazy. So I may be deemed like the worst landscape architect on the universe, but at this point I'm like, well, yes, potentially, because I could have done something else. I could have protested the site, protested the project, and tell the university, you're not gonna do it. But many people did that, and the project continued. So when the RFP came out, I ponder about, should we do something or not? And I felt, and this is very snobbish of me, but I'm like, I don't trust other landscape architects to fight the fight. I didn't elaborate too much on the design, but one of the things we did gain with our process was to push the building onto one edge only, so the park remains, 60% of the site remains public and open. None of the other student housing projects in Berkeley have that condition. They basically, the master plan called out for like a donut building, and there's gonna be open space in the middle. And they're like, there's open space. And I'm like, no. So we did manage to convince the university through this process to at least allow the public access. And to me is, I guess, I'm not sure if that is answering your question, but it's just willingness to be a little bit yelled at. It does help them big, because people yell at me and I'm like, yeah.
A lot of people here have read the Walter's chapter on lifeways, and I really appreciated in your talk the subtlety of the idea that you're observing the lifeways through lots of different methods of engagement, but then you're also really interested in inventing new lifeways, new rituals, and I was curious what, in a really layered cultural landscape, that inventing new rituals could be dangerous, but I'm curious if some of the methods that you showed us, like the multiples, presenting multiples, makes that a more open-ended process that is less, you're imposing less, you're proposing additional rituals that might be added, and then people can. Are there other techniques that you use to think about the new rituals you have?
Not directly. So in the example of the high school, I didn't start with like, I'm gonna create a ritual. It started with like, we're just gonna do a bench, because the bench that I proposed is gonna get VE'd. And so that was kind of my original goal. As we developed the program and working with Mr. Evans, I was like, he was getting excited, I noticed, about like, we can do this next year, we can do this way. And I'm like, that's great. And the students started like, because the prompt for them was, you're graduating in May. What do you want to leave behind? And so for them, it's like, we're going to leave our names. And they did all these beautiful things. So it became this thing like, we are the class of 2025. We're the seniors. And more importantly, we're the seniors who are taking shop class with Mr. Evans. The high school is the champion in football in all of the high schools in Oakland. So they're very, very sport-oriented. And partly why Mr. Evans wanted to do the shop idea is to say, we get some people that can really go into engineering and other classes by getting them exposed to this. And it's very different than with the school. Any funding they get, it goes to sports. This renovation of the site, we're going to get 45 trees, and they're going to get a whole new football field of artificial turf. So we didn't start with that. It actually came as I learned the process and I was there to witness it, then I realized, wow, we're making a new ritual here. Hopefully. I mean, that's my hope, really, is my secret hope. In most of our projects, like the example of the OMCA project, the Oakland Museum of California, the idea of breaking the box was not intended to create a new ritual, but it has, as a result, created a new way to engage with the museum from the lake that never existed before. So sometimes the idea, it is indeed making many options for people to choose. That's one way, I agree. But the second is opening this new platforms for people to begin to see the same space from a different lens. That to me is what actually then groups will do their own rituals. We are not, I mean, I'm nobody to be telling you what is your new ritual. That's a impossible thing to propose. it has to come, but you can open the doors, breaking the walls. We always sort of like talk in those languages, which sounds very aggressive, but it is about, you know, doing an action that then allows you to see spaces differently. So I don't know. Everybody's tired. Go ahead.
I think you sort of were talking about this with the Portrait project, but I'm curious, kind of relating to the last question. How do you? I think the Bay Area is such a specific place in terms of like rituals and history, like the rituals of history, just because like balancing like gentrification and also like the housing crisis specifically. Or how? Yeah, I guess more specific to the area that you practice. How do you balance fostering rituals and also like making history legible?
That's a really good question, actually. A lot of times, I think I was trying to represent in some of the examples is that it's not something that you know going in. And to me, that is, if you haven't practiced, it's probably hard. Like, why are you saying those things? But you will see that if you intern in an office. There's a lot of these things about like, the scope says we shall do this. And that's a good and normal way to run a project. What are we supposed to do? I need to deliver this, I'm doing that. The sort of the way that Walter has allowed me as another, you know, principle of the company is to not stop there, which was my education. It's like, I'm supposed to do this, I'm gonna do it. And I'm gonna do it fantastic. It's gonna be lovely. But if you just stop and are so, you know, diligent about completing scope, you're not allowing to learn the things that happen. And there's a perception that you get the project, you go, you do the research, you meet the community a few times at the beginning. Now I know everything. I'm gonna do the design. But the truth is that as you go, then different things come to light. And so again, this is why I'm trying to say I don't have the answer today, but the practice that I'm able to, at least at this moment, manage as a small team, is to allow those, what people in the professional world call scope creep. Scope creep. So when Port Chicago came about, it was, when I was at Edo or AECOM, I would have been deemed a scope creep. Get an ad service, and if they pay you, then we can do it. But I was going to miss the opportunity to do it because the timing, the clock was clicking. So I met the person who is the main researcher from the Treasure Island Museum. His name is Walt. So Walt is this old guy, white guy actually, old guy, so passionate about this thing. And so he started talking to me, and I was just simply picking up the phone. And I wasn't worried about whether I was going over my hours or my fee. Again, not in every context you can do that because you are responsible. I'm responsible for 20 individuals and their families and their salaries. I cannot just waste my money because I feel good donating my time. So it has to be balanced a little bit. But I think the problem, unfortunately, is that the only way to find those things, you need time. And our world moves fast. Our contracts are finite. You have to deliver. So I feel sometimes the public realm work, just as a general rule, it takes a long time. So when I was mentioning examples, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, that's a very typical public realm project timeline. So that sounds horrible if you are young and excited and you want to see your work built. It's great if you're trying to like give yourself the time to find those stories that people don't come. Day one, hey, excuse me, I want you to represent this. They won't tell me that. It's as you're in it, they're like, oh, by the way, there's this thing that, you know. Or you find it because thing happens. The Port Chicago in particular, what happened, it was the anniversary of the explosion that triggered this sort of refocus on that event that happened because it happened during the time we were developing the project. So I guess I would like to get you a better answer, but it's just being there, sticking around and being willing to, you know, break the scope and let it creep a little bit.
I wanted to say thank you so much.
Thank you.
Alma Du Solier.